Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Monday. I don't think we'll have the same weather situation today that we ended with last week. I wasn't here, but I was in the tornado warning with you all. So, so I don't think we'll have that problem today. Thank you all for joining us today. A reminder to please turn off your cell phone or silence your phone or anything that might make noise. We've got a few lectures left in our series, and the schedule's a little. It's not every week. We have some breaks in the schedule, so I have flyers back there if you need an updated flyer. Okay. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services and have been doing so since 1983. Each semester we focus on a theme, and the theme this semester is the world of the arts. So we're talking film, and last week was textiles, and today we're talking literature. And we will be talking literature with Dr. Jonathan Ivry. He's an associate professor of English and the chair of the Department of Literature, Writing, and Film at UW-Whitewater, where he has taught since 2002. In addition to first-year English and general humanities, he teaches courses on American modernism and the Bible as literature. Please welcome Jonathan Ivry.
All right. Is this, I think it is working. Well, thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful spring afternoon. I'm so glad that some people have chosen to spend some time indoors, even though it's so nice out there. And yes, I'm the chair of the Department of Literature, Writing, and Film, which is actually a brand new department at Whitewater. I don't know if you're aware of that. We used to be Languages and Literatures. And then they decided to split off the World Languages department. So then we had to decide what we were going to name ourselves. And were we going to become the English department, which is traditionally what a department like ours does. But there was a bit of a debate, as some of you maybe who have been in academia know. You get a couple of people in a room and you have 10 different opinions. And so there was a desire to come up with a name that kind of reflected the variety of what we do, because we're not just English majors. We, of course, have our traditional English literature major. We have English education, which is a big contingent of our majors. But we also have creative writers, and we also have a professional writing program. So that was the writing part. And of course, we have a film studies program now. And I know some of you were here, I think, 2 weeks ago with Erica Moulton, our new film studies professor. So literature, writing, and film is the name of our department. But I also remember thinking at the time that even though nobody maybe said this explicitly, calling something an English department nowadays has a little bit of a almost slightly controversial feeling to it, because why are we privileging English? You know, after all, it's the 21st century, and people come from different cultures and backgrounds, and what does America have to do with English anyway? And so I thought that was actually an interesting segue into this talk, which is a little bit about what American literature means, but also looking at an important figure in English literature who actually is somewhat controversial and not even as popular as he was, 40, 50 years ago. The career of D.H. Lawrence, he was a huge, popular, influential novelist, but then his fortunes have sort of dimmed as sort of trends and interests have shifted in literary studies. And especially in the late 60s, or maybe it was the early 70s, a famous feminist author wrote a book in which she basically ripped him to shreds for being a misogynist. And ever since then, he's kind of been less read. But recently, it seems like there's a revival happening. And one of those is this biography that came out in 2021 called Burning Man, by a woman named Frances Wilson, who's a biographer. And this is a fascinating biography. You know, a lot of writers don't really have that interesting of lives, but D.H. Lawrence had a very interesting life, some of which we'll touch on today, and I think she does a really good job of capturing that. And then there are some other recent contemporary authors who have written about their connection to Lawrence. So maybe there's a little bit of a Lawrence revival. But at any rate, here he is, and I'll start the official talk. So, my talk is D.H. Lawrence and the Question of American Literature, and that is maybe a little bit surprising because he was not an American writer. But Lawrence did live in the U.S. for about 2 years total between the years 1922 and 1925 in Taos, New Mexico. And this was a particularly prolific period for Lawrence, during which he wrote many essays, short stories, he completed a novel, he revised and completed a book on American literature that he had been working on and off on for about 7 years. And that book, which I have right here, is called Studies in Classic American Literature. It came out in 1923 when he was living in the US, and it was highly influential, both at the time but also later, how literary critics started to think about American literature as something different from English literature, not just the kind of younger cousin of English literature. So today I want to focus a little bit about that book and about its legacy and about a little bit about Lawrence's biography, especially his time in Mexico. So Lawrence, of course, one of the most important figures of the period known as Modernism, British Modernism, which is roughly the period in literary history from maybe 1895 to 1945, but the period we consider high modernism are the 1920s. This is when James Joyce published Ulysses, T.S. Eliot published The Wasteland. A lot of the kind of big classic modernist texts came out in the 20s, and this is when Lawrence, too, was very active. So in addition to Lawrence, some of the important figures of British modernism are, as I said, James Joyce, but also, of course, Virginia Woolf, Joseph Conrad, E.M. Forster, poetry, T.S. Eliot. But Lawrence, he was born in 1885 in Eastwood, which is in the Nottinghamshire, England, so it's kind of the north central part of England. He died in 1930 in Vence in southern France at the age of 44 from tuberculosis, which he probably contracted first in 1901, and then kind of suffered through this annually, and it would get worse and better. He sort of denied he had TB most of his life. He was buried in France, but then in 1935, I don't know if you can see this timeline, it's a little bit small, I apologize, but his widow, Frida, had his body exhumed and his ashes sent to Taos, New Mexico. And there's actually, in this biography, there's kind of a hilarious story about it's not really clear whether the ashes actually made it all the way to Taos or they got lost or distributed elsewhere along the way. But anyway, this is the chapel in Taos where his ashes are supposedly there. And this is the home in Eastwood where he was born. And that's his wife, Frida. He met her in 1912, and they eloped. And before I get to that, I'll just say, I'll go back to my written text here. Lawrence, as many of you know, is the author of many, many works. He wrote novels, short stories. He was quite an accomplished poet. He wrote travel essays, plays. He wrote literary criticism, and he wrote general essays. Nowadays, I'd probably say his fame rests primarily on just a few of the novels, particularly Sons and Lovers, which was an early autobiographical novel based on his experience growing up in the working-class mining town of Eastwood and his conflicted relationship with his mother and his wife. And actually, when I was in college in the 80s, I remember we read that book in an introductory survey class. And I think one of the reasons they wanted to teach that class is that book is that it really fits well when you talk about psychoanalysis and Freudian psychology and sort of mothers and sons and stuff. Nowadays, I think people are maybe less interested in some of that. Some of his other well-known books include The Rainbow, Women in Love, which is actually Women in Love is a sequel to The Rainbow, and then Lady Chatterley's Lover. These novels were innovative in presenting working class characters from their own perspective. Lawrence, like other novelists of this period, delved deeper into the psychology of his characters than previous novelists had before, and he particularly did not shy away from exploring sexuality and desire, and that made him both controversial but also very appealing to writers who were interested in similarly pushing the envelope. So he kind of helped expand what the novel could be about, and his psychological insight and frank exploration of sex made him highly influential for writers on both sides of the Atlantic, especially even after his death into the 60s. I think there was a sort of a cult of Lawrence. But throughout his life and after, he was no stranger to controversy. He was the perennial outsider and object of suspicion. And in fact, there's another biography a little bit earlier than this one that I mentioned from 2005, and the subtitle is The Life of an Outsider. So what made him an outsider? Well, he was from a working class background, but then when he wrote about that working class background, his family and his friends sort of saw him as having betrayed his origins. But then he was never fully welcomed into the literary or cultural establishment in England, in part because there was, and still is to some extent, strong sort of class prejudice in England. He didn't come from the right background, he didn't go to the right schools, but he was also a very combative personality, and some of his behavior was very scandalous, and particularly this elopement. So in 1912, he was 26. He met Frida Weekly, and she was born von Richthofen. She was a German, she was the daughter of a German aristocrat and was 6 years older than Lawrence. And she was married to a British philologist who taught at the university in Nottingham. And that man had actually been Lawrence's former professor. And shortly after they met, they eloped to Germany, which of course was a huge scandal. And really shocking even today. That would be quite shocking, especially because Frida had 3 young children that she essentially abandoned, and then because of adultery, she lost all custody to those children. So they were in Germany, and then once World War I began, because he was a British citizen, he fell under suspicion of espionage, and they had to return to England. But then once back in England, they were under suspicion now because of having been in Germany and because she was German. So they were kind of hounded wherever they went. Throughout all of this, Lawrence was writing prolifically, but the response to his work reflected the suspicion that he found himself under. So in 1915, this novel, The Rainbow, came out, a saga of 3 generations of a family from the Midlands area of England, near where he grew up, but it was prosecuted for obscenity because of the frank portrayal of sexual desire. But some critics think that it was really motivated, the attack was motivated by the scandal of Lawrence as a person rather than the novel itself. And the novel was successfully prosecuted for obscenity, and the book was banned in England for 11 years. Much later, Lady Chatterley's Lover was also subject to a charge of obscenity and banning. Over 1,000 copies of this novel were burned in 1916. So by the time World War I ended, and he wasn't serving, of course, he was a little bit older, but also his tuberculosis issues made it impossible for him to serve. So by the time the war ended, he was sufficiently discouraged by the reception in England that he and Frida left for Europe in 1919. And while they would return for visits to England, he never actually lived there again for any extended period of time. So they started in Italy between 1919 and 22. They were mostly in Italy, and he wrote a series of essays and later books on Italy that kind of expanded the genre of travel writing. Throughout, though, money was always tight, his health was fragile, the tuberculosis would often flare up in the winter months. And in 1921, the American heiress and patron of the arts, Mabel Dodge Lewin, invited Lawrence and Frida to come to live at her artist colony that she had established in Taos, New Mexico. And so after some hesitation and back and forth, Lawrence agreed, but he and Frida set sail not west from Italy, but rather east, or I don't know which way that is. And they stopped in Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka today, where he had a friend who was at some Buddhist monastery. So they were there for a month or two. Then they were in Australia for about 3 months. He wrote a whole novel while he was in Australia called Kangaroo. Then they stopped in Tahiti for a little bit, just a couple of days, I think. Finally, San Francisco, and then finally they arrived in Taos in September of 1922. And here's a picture of the compound. Has anybody been to Taos? Yeah, I have not been there. Have you seen this? Do you know if you've seen this? So this is still a place you can visit. This is the compound of Mabel Dodge Lewin on the left. She was quite a wealthy heiress. She was kind of an outsized character of this period. She was born to a wealthy family in Buffalo, New York in 1879 and spent much of her life supporting artists financially, but also cultivating artist communities, first in Florence, Italy, where she lived with her first husband, then in New York City and in Provincetown on Cape Cod, and then finally in Taos, New Mexico. So that was the compound. This was the Lawrence cabin on the right, which actually was a little bit outside because he and Mabel actually didn't get along too well right away. She wanted him to live on the compound. He basically found another place to live. Here's a picture of Mabel and her fourth husband, Tony Lujan. So by 1917, Lujan had moved to Taos, New Mexico with her then third husband, where she set up a literary and artist colony. But soon she started seeing a local Native American man, Tony Lujan, who would become her fourth and final husband. I believe that photo might have been taken by the famous photographer Ansel Adams, who also, like many people, spent some time at this artist retreat in the 20s. New Mexico had only been an official state for 5 years in 1912. New Mexico and Arizona both entered the Union in 1912. Taos was already sort of an artist colony even before the Lewins arrived, but also the area was well known as a refuge for tuberculosis patients. In fact, the mountain air and the sunshine had made New Mexico known as, quote, the nation's sanatorium. And, coming out of COVID, it's so interesting to think back on, previous diseases and epidemics that really shaped culture and, the way that tuberculosis or consumption, as it was sometimes called, affected so many people and really shaped the emergence of New Mexico. I hadn't really realized that myself. So Lawrence and Mabel, I think I have another slide that shows you. Oh, yes. So this is another picture of the cabin, and this is Lawrence again. And then this is a picture of a painting called The Lawrence Tree that Carrie was telling me right before she has in her office at Whitewater, which is a kind of funny little coincidence. So George O'Keeffe also had spent some time at this compound, I think after, I'm not sure when actually, it was after Lawrence was there, and there was a tree that Lawrence apparently liked to sit under and write, and that was known as the Lawrence Tree, and she painted this, and this is the Lawrence Tree. If you go back to this here, I don't know, maybe some of those trees look like, I don't know, I haven't been to Taos. That's really, that's high on my list of places to visit. I've been to Arizona, but never, and Colorado, but not New Mexico. So Lawrence and Mabel had a tumultuous relationship, but he would later look back on this period in Taos as one of the happiest of his life. And in an essay he wrote that was entitled New Mexico from 1928, so he had already left New Mexico by then. He wrote, and I apologize for this, I'm going to read it out loud, but I just thought I'd put it up there. I think New Mexico was the greatest experience from the outside world that I have ever had. It certainly changed me forever. Curious as it may sound, it was New Mexico that liberated me from the present era of civilization, the great era of material and mechanical development. Now, I put that in bold because, I mean, that really gets at some of the things that Lawrence was always struggling against, this idea that the modern world is too focused on material goods, material greed, technology, mechanical development technology, right? So this idea that going back to New Mexico was a liberation from the oppressive nature of the modern world. And then he went on, months spent in Holy Candy in Ceylon, where he had been before arriving there. The holy of holies of Southern Buddhism had not touched the great psyche of materialism and idealism which dominated me. Idealism, this another thing that he was obsessed about, was how the Western mind is so focused on ideas all the time, and we have to kind of liberate ourselves from our thinking brains. Our thinking brains are actually our enemy. This is kind of a romantic idea that you also see in other writers, but I mean that was part of his real passion for the physical and the emotional, to get rid of the domination of the ideas. And years, even in the exquisite beauty of Sicily, right among the old Greek paganism that still lives there, had not shattered the essential Christianity on which my character was established. So Christianity also not good, because also for him, it represented a kind of repression of the vital physical energies that a human has to sort of tap into. Australia was a sort of dream or trance, like being under a spell, the self remaining unchanged, so long as the trance did not last too long. Tahiti, in a mere glimpse, repelled me, and so did California after a stay of a few weeks. There seemed a strange brutality in the spirit of the western coast, and I felt, oh, let me get away. I kind of find this amusing, but if a lot of people, it's like, it's crazy. But the moment I saw the brilliant, proud morning shine high up over the deserts of Santa Fe, something stood in my soul, and I started to attend. In the magnificent, fierce morning of New Mexico, one sprang awake. A new part of the soul woke up suddenly, and the old world gave way to a new. It's almost like Lawrence was searching his whole life for a place like Taos, New Mexico. But what was it about Taos that affected him and those other places hadn't? And I think in part his fascination with 19th century American literature had prepared him to fall in love with the American Southwest. And that fascination was expressed in the book that he revised and finished while in Taos, The Studies in Classic American Literature. So I want to look at that book a little bit now. So even as a boy, Lawrence, growing up in northern central England, Lawrence had been drawn to certain American writers, and particularly works like James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, The Last of the Mohicans. These were adventure stories of the American wilderness that even at that time were sort of largely dismissed as not serious literature, but they were more suitable for boys or adolescents. Lawrence's thoughts on American literature started to coalesce around 1916 and 17 when he started to take notes for essays that he would eventually publish. 8 essays in total. They first appeared in the English Review magazine in 1918 and 19. But then living in Taos allowed him to review these essays, revise them, with an eye not just on this idealized America that he had read about in books as a boy in England, but now more informed by the actual experiences he had in New Mexico, the nature, but also encountering Native Americans, and starting with Tony Lujan. Why was this book important? Well, it was one of the first books, as I've said, to take seriously the idea of American literature as something distinctive. For Lawrence, he read American literature, classic American literature, as a body of texts and authors struggling to unconsciously confront the essence or the meaning of America in contrast to England or Europe. So before Lawrence's book, American literature, like the nation itself, was considered the coarser, younger cousin of England, a kind of upstart nation, wild frontier, where nothing of cultural value could possibly germinate. And in a way, that was also Lawrence's view partially. There's something ironic about the word classic in the title. But especially after World War I, there was a strong sense among a lot of writers in Europe that European culture had kind of run its course, right? The devastation of World War I, the unbelievable slaughter and destruction kind of made Europe kind of dead place. And this is like the theme of Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, and Ezra Pound also wrote about that in some of his poetry, that the civilization is a failure and we have to look elsewhere for something to revitalize it. So for Lawrence, he saw the true achievement of American literature as the rejection of European cultural traditions that he saw as having reached the end of their relevance. Now, the book itself is, like much of his writings, idiosyncratic, combative. He's not interested in a kind of sober, comprehensive account of American literature. The authors that he focuses on are these 19th century forebears. He has short chapters on Benjamin Franklin, Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, which probably, I don't know, you remember that from if you took an American Lit intro years ago, James Fenimore Cooper, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Richard Henry Dana, another author not really well read anymore, Herman Melville, and Walt Whitman. So there are some notable omissions there. There's no Mark Twain, there's no Ralph Waldo Emerson, there's no Henry David Thoreau, there's no Emily Dickinson. But the book's most significant legacy is probably that Lawrence resurrected Herman Melville, who had by that time basically fallen into obscurity. So the way that Moby Dick has been sort of put on the shelf as a kind of the classic 19th century novel, that's really thanks to Lawrence. Now, Lawrence's own international celebrity at the time ensured that there would be an audience for this book. But then again, studies came out at a point when America was just starting maybe to really extend its power in the 20s, right? The roaring 20s, before the stock market crash and the Depression. But Lawrence is not interested in the new modern America. He's interested in looking at those 18th and 19th century origins. There's very little mention, if any, of slavery. African-American experience is not referred to in studies, but the idea of race is actually a big part of this book. And there's this opposition that he sets up between the white America and the Native American culture. And this is an opposition that comes even more extreme in the novel that he ended up writing about Mexico, which he wrote right after this, which was called The Plumed Serpent. So, and this is something that's also distinctive. Like, not a lot of writers were actually writing about Native Americans at this point. And certainly the ones in, the coasts had no interaction with Native populations. Lawrence did attend certain powwows and performances and met Native people, and sort of that kind of informed his thinking about it. So the other part that is part of this, which I'll just mention briefly, is that Lawrence was also, like a lot of writers in that period, interested in spiritualism and theosophy. If you've heard of Madame Blavatsky, this kind of pseudo-New Agey religion of spirit and polarities and things like that. But alongside certain claims about spirit and magnetism is a historical argument that remains somewhat fresh and provocative today. So I'm going to get into that a little bit now. America, Lawrence says, is built on a foundation of lies, that it needs to tell itself about itself, sort of the same way that the ego in the Freudian theory has to suppress the id, right? Those instincts that are sort of dangerous and not socially acceptable. So take the idea of freedom, America's devotion to freedom. On the third page of his introduction to the book, Lawrence dispatches the notion that the English pilgrims came in search of religious liberty. He says, speaking about the Pilgrim, he didn't come in search of freedom of worship. England had more freedom of worship in the year 1700 than America had, won by Englishmen who wanted freedom and so stopped at home and fought for it and got it. Freedom of worship? Read the history of New England during the first century of its existence. So in other words, the Puritans didn't care about freedom, right? And that's probably true to a certain extent. Freedom anyhow, the land of the free, this is the land of the free. Why, if I say anything that displeases them, the free mob will lynch me, and that's my freedom. Free. Why, I have never been in any country where the individual has such an abject fear of his countrymen, because, as I say, they are free to lynch him the moment he shows he is not one of them. So you can see very provocative, kind of counter-intuitive takes on America. So what was the impetus for the American experiment? Not freedom, but rather for Lawrence, it was the desire to, quote, get away. But what was it that they wanted to get away from? And he writes, quote, in the long run, away from themselves, away from everything. That's why most people have come to America and still do come, to get away from everything they are and have been. Now, the problem with this impulse to get away is that it's purely reactive, right? It's an expression of the desire to reject traditions and structures of authority that come with them. So those first American pilgrims, Lawrence claims, they were rejecting not only kings and bishops and popes, but they were also rejecting the new humanism emerging from the Renaissance. So they were rejecting different structures of authority. But once this rejection has occurred, what is left to fill the void? That's the ongoing problem of American literature. What is it really about or for? It can't just be a rejection of Europe and England, because a culture that is built on perennial rejection lacks the spiritual or cultural foundation on which to establish new values or structures of meaning. So that starts to sound almost like a classic conservative position, sort of anti-freedom, kind of critical of rejecting culture. But Lawrence is quick to assert that pretty much all the old European institutions, the church, feudalism, humanism, they have lost their legitimacy or relevancy. And he writes, mastery, kingship, fatherhood had their power destroyed at the time of the Renaissance. And then he is just as much skeptical of the Enlightenment idealism, what I referred to before, that idea that you can think through and solve problems with your mind, which we find in the emphasis on science, technology, rational thinking. So he was just as skeptical of that. So, and that's where democracy comes from, this idea that everybody can think for themselves and have freedoms and rights. Lawrence had a lot of scorn for democracy. He says that the will of the people is nothing but a figment. And that also is surprising, given that he wasn't from the upper class, so you think he would be in favor of democracy. So he's a controversial and complicated figure. Each chapter in the studies reads a different American author as representing this foundational blindness or hypocrisy. In the chapter devoted to Benjamin Franklin, Lawrence mercilessly skewers the platitudes of this quintessential American figure, whose Enlightenment, faith in progress, and self-reliance Lawrence finds pretty laughable. The famous list of virtues that Franklin drew up in his autobiography, I don't know if you remember that book, but he has this very clear list of ways to live. It's like the original self-help book. If you set a schedule and do these things, your life will be fine, right? Lawrence sees this as the Enlightenment worldview that tries to fence out anything impractical, dangerous, irrational, which is basically everything that makes us human and alive. He thinks that Franklin is trying to tame and master the world in a way that the worst impulses of modernity try to do. The American economy, capitalism, mechanization of technology, seeing the world as something to exploit, to profit from, to dominate. Lawrence identifies the dark side and the hypocrisy of Franklin's self-satisfied worldview in an offhand comment Franklin wrote after an encounter with Native Americans. And this is a quote from Franklin's, from the book, or from the book, or maybe it was a letter, I'm not sure now, but that Lawrence quotes in the studies. So this is Franklin speaking. He says, "And indeed, if it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for the cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means." So this kind of vicious attitude toward the native peoples belies this more enlightened, rational approach to the world that Franklin wants to show. But underneath it is that sort of darker impulse. Lawrence is all about like facing and accepting and embracing those sort of unattractive impulses. So in contrast to Franklin's list of virtues, Lawrence proposes his own rather amusing creed that reads as follows. That I am I, that my soul is a dark forest, that my known self will never be more than a little clearing in the forest, that God, strange gods, come forth from the forest into the clearing of my known self and then go back, that I must have the courage to let them come and go, that I will never let mankind put anything over me, but that I will always try to recognize and submit to the gods in me and the gods in other men and women. So very anti-Benjamin Franklin attitude, but for Lawrence, this is more in keeping with the true spirit of America, this kind of wilderness aspect. He then goes on to produce a version of Franklin's list of virtues, a mocking rejoinder, and he says under cleanliness, so for cleanliness, Franklin had written, tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. And Lawrence writes, don't be too clean, it impoverishes the blood. So, let's see how I'm doing here. I think I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. Well, this idea that my soul is a dark forest, again, linking the irrational and the wilderness of America, and also connecting it to Native Americans. There's a kind of attraction to Native Americans, but also a horror of Native Americans. And some of the things he says about Native Americans are pretty offensive, right? There was that sort of normalized racism and condescension to Native peoples that was not uncommon back then. And actually, I just saw this movie, The Killers of the Flower Moon, that was nominated for an Oscar. Maybe some of you have seen that. That's the exact same period, if you think about it, the mid-20s. So the kind of attitude toward Native Americans as something to be exploited, tolerated, expropriate their land or their oil. But what's different about Lawrence is that he, at the same time, is deeply admiring that they are not Europeans, right? They don't have that kind of impulse to dominate the land. They don't have the kind of intellectual trying to understand everything. So he stakes out a kind of strange position. He's at once loyal to a whiteness that he largely despises, but also honoring a non-white otherness that he sees as threatening and also hostile and closed off to white people. But this non-white otherness is the source of a vital energy for American culture and American literature because it ultimately is the spirit of the place, and that's the phrase which is the title of the first chapter. And here's another quote. He says, different places on the face of the earth have different vital effluence. This is a little bit of that theosophic ideas of spirit, right, and energies. So different places on the face of the earth have different vital effluence, different vibration, different chemical exhalation, different polarity with different stars. Call it what you like, but the spirit of the place is a great reality. So American literature can never be like English literature because we're in a different place. We have a different polarity. We have a different vibration. We have a different chemical exhalation. So terms like effluence, vibration, polarity, they reflect in part the influence of theosophism and spiritualism But the larger point for Lawrence is that the spirit of America is not the spirit of Europe. It is partly the spirit of the white rejection of European mastery, and partly the spirit of the indigenous people and cultures, but that part of the spirit is ultimately unknowable to white people. And well-intentioned attempts to understand it, for white people to understand the native spirit, is what he calls a kind of vampirism. So American literature is constantly in search of what it's about, in search of what it means. It's a fusion of cultures, it's related to place. So the shadow presence of Mabel Dodge Lewin kind of hovers over this. She's probably who he had in mind when he was talking about vampires. And he was very contemptuous of her attempts to, quote unquote, save the Indians. Native Americans, he believed, needed no saving by well-intentioned but misguided liberal white Americans, even though it was very true that Native Americans were facing serious threats at the time. In New Mexico, there was, well, in the federal government, there was the Bursum Bill, which was proposed in 1921 by New Mexico Senator Holm Burson, that was basically a scheme to break up the Indian reservation lands, allow individual Native peoples to own private property, but that was really a ruse to allow them to then sell it to white people. So there were serious threats, and people like Lewin and others in her circle were lobbying in Washington and working contacts and political efforts to counter this bill. Lawrence didn't care about politics. He was not practical-minded. For him, the elusive spirit was the point of it all, right? And he writes in a series of essays in this period about his various interactions with Native peoples, not trying to understand or know them in that vampiric way, but really to record how there's an impenetrable otherness that a white Englishman could never penetrate. And that's a beautiful thing for him, right? We're not here to like understand the other. And that's very interesting today too, when we think about continuing debates about multiculturalism and wanting to understand others, see common humanity among people, but also to respect difference, and things maybe aren't always transferable. All right, I'm kind of running a little bit late, so I want to wrap it up. Here's some slides of Lawrence and Frida and a friend of theirs in the middle visiting Mexico. They took 2 extended trips in Mexico, and he wrote this very famous novel, also very controversial novel, about Mexico, where there's a character sort of based on Mabel Dodge Lewin who goes to Mexico. And a lot of that novel is about this woman, Kate, in the novel. She gets involved with this man, Ramon Cipriano, who is a Mexican trying to spearhead a revival of the old religion, the old native religion, and the old gods that were suppressed by the church and the Spanish colonial administration. And in this novel, the revival of the old religion is presented as both necessary and inevitable, because it is the spirit of the place. And he writes, or the narrator writes, Jesus is no savior to the Mexicans. The attempt to export Christianity to America will always fail. The resurrection of the old gods is the inevitable trajectory of that novel. So even though that novel is set in Mexico, it really is Lawrence's American novel, trying to get this sense of like, what is the authentic spirit of a place? How is it connected to the native peoples? There are descriptions of Native American religious rites and ceremonies that recall Lawrence's visits to the Apache and Hopi Indians dance ceremonies. And in that essay, New Mexico, that he wrote in 1928, and I quoted earlier, he wrote, "I had no permanent feeling of religion till I came to New Mexico and penetrated into the old human race experience there. It is curious that it should be in America, of all places, that a European should really experience religion after touching the old Mediterranean and the East. It is curious that one should get a sense of living religion from the Red Indians, having failed to get it from Hindus or Sicilian Catholics or Sinhalese." And in an earlier essay called Pan in America, Lawrence wrote that while the Greek pagan god Pan died in Europe with the advent of Christianity, he writes, still in America among the Indians, the oldest Pan is alive, but dying fast. So Pan, if you recall, the Greek god Pan is a kind of nature god. And for Lawrence, represents that kind of Native American affinity with nature, a tree, right, the Lawrence tree, a kind of sacred kind of quality in nature. This is that kind of religious energy that European Christianity and then the European Enlightenment really tried to repress and dominate and say, of course, is not real or not true. All right, so today Lawrence's theosophist-inspired musings about spirit and energy feel less relevant, but his attempts to tease apart the idealized American narrative from the actual American experience, that feels sort of prescient. We're still sort of arguing about what the history of America means. Is it Franklin's liberal Enlightenment story of progress and improvement, or is that really a mask that kind of covers up a kind of darker desire to exploit or destroy or dominate nature? It's interesting, speaking of another movie, because it was just the Oscars last night, Oppenheimer, right? That movie was also in New Mexico, right? That's where America harnessed the incredible power of that Enlightenment science world. But what do we lose? I mean, that's kind of what that movie is also sort of about. So New Mexico as the site for both of those things is sort of interesting. The last person he talks about in the studies is Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman is said to be the last, is kind of a hope for the future. If you're familiar, if you remember Walt Whitman, he has his big poem, Song of Myself, celebration of the body, and you think Lawrence would be into that. He's a little bit into it, but he also thinks the celebration of the body is a little bit overdone. But what he thinks that Whitman got right is Whitman's appreciation for the energy of the American place and the experience. Despite his contempt for equality, Lawrence says that Whitman is the poet of democracy because he's the poet of the open road, who can open himself up to the variety of human and American experience without attempting to master it, idealize it, evaluate it, dominate it. He writes, purified of merging, purified of myself, the exultant message of American democracy, of souls in the open road, full of glad recognition, full of fierce readiness, full of the joy of worship, when one soul sees a greater soul. So in other words, the American experience needs to be a kind of welcoming of the variety of humanity in all of its strange multiplicity, without that white European desire to absorb, dominate, master. By, quote, meeting all the other wayfarers on the road, Lawrence says, you are catching the vibration of their soul and flesh as we pass. This, he says, is a new great doctrine of life, a new great morality, a morality of actual living and not of salvation. So rejecting salvation is both a swipe against Mabel Dodge Lewin, against Christianity, against Enlightenment humanism. The idea is to experience life fully on its terms, wholly, and to embrace it more at the kind of unity with nature that we see, or that he saw in Native Americans in New Mexico. And he says, we find the true rhythm of the American continent speaking out in Whitman. He is the first white Aboriginal. Thank you very much. So I talked a little bit longer than I realized, so I apologize. But if you have any questions or comments, or if you've been to New Mexico, I'd love to hear your impressions of it, or if any of you have read Lawrence or remember Lawrence, or yeah, go ahead.
Let me come over here with the microphone so everyone can hear, okay?
How old was he when he died?
He was 40, I think.
Oh.
44. Yeah,
Okay.
1930. Right? Yeah.
I just wondered.
Wait. I had it up here. 85 to 30. So 45, right? 45. Huh. I guess I added, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That was very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Come over here.
Did he know Whitman, or did he have any friendships with other American writers who were his contemporaries?
Well, Whitman was not his contemporary. Whitman was in the 19th century and Civil War. Yeah, he knew a lot of the big writers of the period. Not so much American writers, although there were people around that circle in Taos. But in England, he would have encountered most of the big writers of the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Other questions?
When you were in school, was he known for Lady Chatterley's lover?
You know, as I said, so to be perfectly frank, this is kind of new area for me. My area of focus is more on American poetry of this period, like Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams. But I kind of got into this. That's a whole other story. But I mean, I remember in college, Sons and Lovers was the big novel. And I think, as I said earlier, it's because of that, it kind of lends itself to a kind of Freudian analysis, if you're interested in thinking about literature as psychological expressions of character issues. Lady Chatterley's Lover, I did not read in college, and I don't remember people reading it. There was a Netflix movie version of this that came out like a year ago, and oh my goodness, it was pretty explicit. I was like, yeah, this is why he's controversial. Yeah, and then I do have the book, and yeah, it's pretty explicit sexually. Yeah, but no, I don't think people are reading it like they used to. I think it was considered so out there and shocking. Of course, nowadays it's harder to shock people. You know, it's probably pretty tame by comparison to today. Although, honestly, if you read it, it can be pretty explicit too. So, you know, I'm not going to read you any quotes from that, though. You have it in the library? Okay, you can do a book club.
He was apparently influenced by the American natives. How about some of the people from Tahiti or the Aborigines from Australia? Did he comment anything about them?
Well, that was so interesting. Yeah. So he, as I think I showed in that quote, he did not like being in Sri Lanka and Ceylon at all. He really hated how kind of primitive it was. You know, he talked about the rats and the dirt and all that stuff. And Tahiti, and there's actually a funny little part of the story that was in this biography. So he was in Tahiti for just a couple of days, and then he got on the ship to go from Tahiti to San Francisco. But there was actually a movie crew and cast that were filming a movie in Tahiti in 1922, and they were on the ship with him, and he hated them. He was like, oh, these terrible Hollywood people, they're so cheap and superficial. So I mean, he was kind of a misanthrope through and through, you know. But I think, it's a good question. Why was he entranced by the Native Americans and not by the Aboriginals? I think it was that he, as a boy, had read those James Fenimore Cooper novels and had felt like, you know, there was a connection to American Indians. And he went with Tony Lewin to see these Apache dance ceremonies, and he was very taken with that and moved. And he tells a story in one of those essays on how at one of those powwows, this white woman tried to go into one of the meeting rooms, and this Native person came up and was like, no, you can't go in there, you're white. And she was just like, what? And Lawrence loved that. He was like, no, you can't just go in there as a white person. You think because you're a white European, you can sort of take over or go anywhere you want. No, you can't, and that's not your your culture. So in a weird way, he was celebrating this culture, but then he also says, you know, I didn't quote some of this or nastier stuff he says about them, because he did think they weren't able, Native people weren't able to like think abstractly in that same way. You know, they were sort of more primitive, for, you know, lack of a better word. Yeah.
The other thing, we were in Taos once,
Yeah.
and there was a group of the native people there,
Yeah.
and they had this large stove, dome-type stove, where they're baking bread,
Mm.
and we bought some of this.
Yeah.
We were talking with this woman, mentioned that we were from Wisconsin. She said, "Wisconsin, my daughter goes to school in Madison. Do you know her?"
That's the great thing about anywhere you go in the U.S., you'll see the Badger sweatshirts, and not so much the Warhawk sweatshirts, but you do see, yeah, soon, right, yeah.
Other questions?
I think there was another one over here.
Over here? Did you have another question?
Do you have that biography?
Yeah, it's right here. You
Is
want?
it- no, I mean,
Oh.
is that listed in your brochure or?
No, but I can certainly leave that information with Carrie or with you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great read. It was really fun. Yeah. And you know, this is my version of Studies of Classic. I don't know where I got it, but I love that. I just noticed it's $1.75, so it must be pretty old. A Viking compass book. You can't get that nowadays. 1972. So, you know, books were cheaper. I know, right? I remember 1972.
So if there's any other questions, you can definitely come up and ask Professor Ivry. But please join me in thanking Professor Jonathan Ivry. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you so much.